Armenians living in France took up arms and fought the resistance against the Axis forces. The most significant Armenian resistant were 23 strong men led by Misak Manoukian, who were hanged on February 21, 1944. Spanish Maquis. Main article: Spanish Maquis. Following their defeat in the Spanish Civil War in early 1939, about 500,000 Spanish Republicans fled to France to escape imprisonment or execution. 277 on the north side of the Pyrenees. Such refugees were confined in internment camps such as Camp Gurs and Camp Vernet. 228-277, although over half of these had been repatriated to Spain or elsewhere. By the time Pétain proclaimed the Vichy regime in 1940-46, the 120,000 to 150,000 who remained 278 became political prisoners, and the foreign equivalent to the service du travail obligatoire. The compagnies de travailleurs étrangers, companies of foreign workers, or CTE, began to pursue them for slave labor. 279. The CTE was initially seen as a welcome break from the monotony of the camps by many. Louis Montagut, a member of the CTE, described how we, the Spanish Republican internees, held so much desire not to see the camps that we accepted the positions offered by the CTE without the slightest objection. We went out of the way to lose the shameful tag of undesirables. 280. The CTE permitted prisoners to leave the internment camps if they agreed to work in German factories. 281. But as many as 60,000 Republicans recruited for the labor service managed to escape and join the French resistance. 46. Thousands of suspected anti-fascist Republicans were deported to German concentration camps instead. However, 282 most were sent to Mauthausen, where, of the 10,000 Spaniards registered, only 2,000 survived the war. 283. Many Spanish escapees joined French resistance groups. Others formed their own autonomous groups which became known as the Spanish Maquis. In April 1942, Spanish communists formed an organization called the XIV Corps, an armed guerrilla movement of about 3,400 combatants by June 1944. 278. Although the group first worked closely with the Franksteirers et Partisans, FTP, it reformed as the Agrupación de Guerrilleros Españoles, Spanish guerrilla group. Age in May 1944. 284. The name change was intended to convey the group's composition. Spanish soldiers ultimately advocating the fall of General Francisco Franco. 278. After the German army had been driven from France, the Spanish Maquis refocused on Spain. Czechs and Slovaks. Among Czechs and Slovaks who joined the French resistance were Otakar Hromadko, Vera Waldes, and Artur London. German anti-Nazis. From spring 1943, German and Austrian anti-Nazis who had fought in the International Brigades during the Spanish Civil War fought in Loser and the Cévennes alongside the French resistance in the Franksteirers et Partisans. 46. During the first years of the occupation, they had been employed in the CTE, but following the German invasion of the southern zone in 1942, the threat increased, and many joined the Maquis. They were led by militant German communist Otto Kuhn, a former member of the Reichstag in the Weimar Republic, who had over 2,000 Germans in the FTP under his command by July 1944. He fought the Nazis directly, as in an April 1944 battle in Saint-Étienne-Valais Française in which his soldiers destroyed a Feldgendarmerie unit, or in an ambush of the Waffen-SS on June 5, 1944. 285. Luxembourgers. 400 men from Luxembourg, which was annexed into Germany, many of whom had refused to serve in or who had deserted from the German Wehrmacht, left their tiny country to fight in the French Maquis, where they were particularly active in the regions of Lyon, Grenoble, and the Ardennes, although many of them were killed in the war. Others, like Anton Diederich, rose to high rank in the resistance. Diederich, known only as Capitaine Baptiste, had 77 Maquis soldiers under his command and is best known for attacking Riom prison, where he and his fighters freed every one of 114 inmates who had been sentenced to death. 286. Hungarians. Many Hungarian émigrés, some of them Jewish, were artists and writers working in Paris at the time of the occupation. They had gone to Paris in the 1920s and 1930s to escape repression in their homeland. Many joined the resistance, where they were particularly active in the regions of Lyon, Grenoble, Marseille, and Toulouse. Jewish resistors included Imre Epstein in the Hungarian group at Toulouse, György Vadnai, future Lausanne rabbi at Lyon, the writer Emil Shidia at Limoges. Also participating were the painter Sandor Jasa, the sculptor Istvan Hajdu, Etienne Hajdu, the journalists Laszlo Korers and Imre Gyamrai, the photographers Andor André Steiner, Lucien Hervé and Irvin Martin. Thomas Elek, 1924–1944, Imre Glass, 1902–1944, and Joseph Boxer, 1905–1944, were among 23 resistors executed for their work with the legendary Manouchian group. The Germans executed nearly 1,100 Jewish resistors of different nationalities during the occupation, while others were killed in action. 230–287. Italian anti-fascist. On 3 March 1943, representatives of the Italian Communist Party and Italian Socialist Party who had taken refuge in France signed the Pact of Lyon, which marked the beginning of their participation in the resistance. Italians were particularly numerous in the Hitler-annexed Moselle industrial area, where they played a determining role in the creation of the department's main resistance organization, Group Mario. 288. Vittorio Culpo is an example of Italians in the French resistance. Polish resistance in France during World War II. Main article: Polish resistance in France during World War II. The majority of the Polish soldiers and some Polish civilians who stayed in France after the German victory in 1940, as well as one Polish pilot shot down over France, one of many Polish pilots flying for the RAF, joined the French resistance, notably including Tony Halleck and Alexander Kawakowski. Cajun Americans. While not part of the French resistance, French-speaking Cajun soldiers in the United States military posed as local civilians in France to channel American assistance to the resistance. 289. Beginnings of a coordinated resistance. Resistance from Huelgoat. From 1940 to 1942, the first years of the German occupation of France, there was no systematically organized resistance capable of coordinated fighting throughout France. Active opposition to the German and Vichy authorities was sporadic and carried out only by a tiny and fragmented set of operatives. 290. Most French men and women put their faith in the Vichy government and its figurehead, Marshal Pétain, who continued to be widely regarded as the savior of France. 291–292. Opinions which persisted until their unpopular policies and their collaboration with the foreign occupiers became broadly apparent. The earliest resistance organizations had no contact with the Western Allies and received no material aid from London or anywhere else. Consequently, most focused on generating nationalist propaganda through the distribution of underground newspapers. 293. Many of the major movements, such as Défense de la France, were primarily engaged in publishing and distributing their newspapers. Even after they became more intensively activist, propaganda and the cultivation of positive morale remained, until the very end of the war, their most important concerns. 294. Early acts of violent resistance were often motivated more by instinct and fighting spirit than by any formal ideology. 295. But later several distinct political alignments and visions of post-liberation France developed among the resistance organizations. These differences sometimes resulted in conflicts, but the differences among resistance factions were usually papered over by their shared opposition to Vichy and the Germans, 296, and over time, the various elements of the resistance began to unite. Many of the networks recruited and controlled by the British and Americans were not perceived by the French as particularly interested in establishing a united or integrated resistance operation, and the guerrilla groups controlled by the Communists were only slightly more attracted by the idea of joining of a resistance umbrella organization. Nonetheless, a contact between de Gaulle's envoys and the Communists was established at the end of 1942. The liberation of Corsica in September 1943, a clear demonstration of the strength of communist insurgency, was accomplished by the FTP, an effective force not yet integrated into the secret army and not involved with General Henry Giraud, the Free French, or the political unification of the resistance. The French resistance began to unify in 1941. This was evidenced by the formation of movements in the Vichy zone centered on such figures as Henry Frenay, Combat, Emmanuel Destir de la Vigerie, Liberation Sud, and François de Menthon, Liberté, each of whom was, independently, an agent of the Free French. Formal consolidation was accomplished through the intervention of Jean Moulin. Prefect of Eure-et-Loire in 1939, Moulin was subsequently a part of the Air Ministry of Pierre Cot. In this context, he had forged a strong network of relationships in anti-fascist circles. Sometime after November 1940, the idea of teaming up with his former colleague, Gaston Cousin Fr., to identify and contact a number of potential resistance centers of influence occurred to him. But only during the summer of 1940, was he able to make the most critical contacts, including contact with Henry Frenay, leader of the movement not yet called Combat but still known as the National Liberation Movement FR. He also established contact with de Menthon and Emmanuel Destir. In the report he wrote for de Gaulle, he spoke of these three movements and entertained the possibility of bringing them together under the acronym LLL. Maquis. The Maquis, French pronunciation, M'-ki, were rural guerrilla bands of French resistance fighters, called maquisards, during the occupation of France in World War II. Initially, they were composed of men who had escaped into the mountains to avoid conscription into Vichy France's service du travail obligatoire, STO, to provide forced labor for Nazi Germany. To avert capture and deportation to Germany, they became increasingly organized into non-active resistance groups. Jean Moulin's intercession. The majority of resistance movements in France were unified after Moulin's formation of the Conseil National de la Résistance, CNR, in May 1943, 197-297. CNR was coordinated with the Free French forces under the authority of French generals Henry Giraud and Charles de Gaulle and their body, the Comité Français de Libération Nationale, CFLN. Activities. The 30 September 1943 issue of the resistance newspaper, Défense de la France. Economic resistance. By June 1941, 81% of the miners employed by the National Coal Mining Company, Charbonnages de France, were on strike, slowing deliveries of coal to German industrial plants supporting the war effort. Citation needed. Clandestine press. Main article, Clandestine press of the French resistance. The first action of many resistance movements was the publication and distribution of clandestine press material. This was not the case with all movements, since some refused civil action and preferred armed resistance by groups such as CDLR and CDLL. Most clandestine newspapers were not consistent in their editorial stance and often consisted of only a single sheet, because the sale of all raw materials, paper, ink, stencils, was prohibited. By 1942, however, about 300,000 copies of underground publications reached around 2 million readers. Resistance workers used friendly printshop facilities at night. Staff risked the Germans noticing that a resistance newspaper used the same typeface as officially sanctioned documents. Profession-specific newspapers also existed. Le Médecin Français advised doctors to immediately approve known collaborators for service du travail obligatoire, while medically disqualifying everyone else. La Terre advised farmers on how to send food to resistance members. Bulletin des Chemins de Fer encouraged railroad workers to sabotage German transportation. Unter uns, Among Us, published in German for the occupiers, printed stories of German defeats on the Eastern Front, 298. In September 1940, Agnes Humbert and Jean Cassou, then employed at the Musée National des Arts et Traditions Populaires in Paris, and finding they were to be replaced by German-approved staff, used a Roneo machine belonging to the museum to publish an open letter by Paul Rivet to Marshal Pétain. This was followed by their first tract, Vichy fait la guerre, Vichy wages war, written by Cassou, 299 at the end of 1940. A group of 10, including Humbert, Cassou, Marcel Abraham, and Claude Aveline, founded a clandestine newsletter called Resistance, respecting and supporting de Gaulle but circumspect in references to that ridiculous old fool Pétain. 300, it ran to 5 issues before the arrest of the editors in March 1940. In the Northern Zone, Pantagruel, the newspaper of Frank Tireur, had a circulation of 10,000 by June 1941, but was quickly replaced by Liberation Nord, which attained a circulation of 50,000, and by January 1944, Défense de la France was distributing 450,000 copies, 301, in the Southern Zone. François de Menthon's newspaper Liberté merged with Henry Frenet's Vérité to form Combat in December 1941, which grew to a circulation of 200,000 by 1944, 302. During the same period, Pantagruel brought out 37 issues, Libération Sud 54 and Témoignage Chrétien 15. The underground press brought out books as well as newspapers through publishing houses, such as Les Editions de Minuit, the Midnight Press. 190, which had been set up to circumvent Vichy and German censorship. The 1942 novel Le Silence de la Mer, The Silence of the Sea, by Jean Bruller, quickly became a symbol of mental resistance through its story of how an old man and his niece refused to speak to the German officer occupying their house. 303-304. Intelligence. Frank Steyerers and Allied paratroopers reporting on the situation during the Battle of Normandy in 1944. The intelligence networks were by far the most numerous and substantial of resistance activities. They collected information of military value, such as coastal fortifications of the Atlantic Wall or Wehrmacht deployments. The BCRA and the different British intelligence services often competed with one another to gather the most valuable information from their resistance networks in France. 48-305. The first agents of the Free French to arrive from Britain landed on the coast of Brittany as early as July 1940. They were Lieutenants Mansion, Saint-Jacques and Corvisart and Colonel Ramey, and didn't hesitate to get in touch with the anti-Germans within the Vichy military, such as Georges Laustin-Alaco and Georges Groussard. The various resistance movements in France had to understand the value of intelligence networks in order to be recognized or receive subsidies from the BCRA or the British. The intelligence service of the Frank Steyerers et Partisans was known by the code letters FANA 306 and headed by Georges Bayer, the brother-in-law of Charles Tillon. Information from such services was often used as a bargaining chip to qualify for airdrops of weapons. The transmission of information was first done by radio transmitter. Later, when air links by the Westland Lysander became more frequent, some information was also channeled through these couriers. By 1944, the BCRA was receiving 1,000 telegrams by radio every day and 2,000 plans every week, 307 many radio operators, called pianists, were located by German goniometers. Their dangerous work gave them an average life expectancy of around 6 months. 308 even children partook in radio work, see Eddie Palachi. According to the historian Jean-François Murixiol, throughout the war, how to communicate remained the principal difficulty of intelligence networks. Not only were the operators few and inept, but their information was dangerous. 309. Sabotage. USAAF B-17 flying fortresses, dropping supplies to the Maquis du Workers in 1944. Sabotage was a form of resistance adopted by groups who wanted to go beyond just distributing clandestine press publications. Many laboratories were set up to manufacture explosives. In August 1941, the Parisian chemist France Bloch-Ceresin assembled a small laboratory in her apartment to provide explosives to communist resistance fighters. 91. The lab also produced cyanide capsules to allow the fighters to evade torture if arrested. 91. Indeed, she herself was arrested in February 1942, tortured, and deported to Hamburg, where she was beheaded by guillotine in February 1943. In the southern occupation zone, Jacques Renouvin engaged in the same activities on behalf of groups of Franc-Styrers. Stealing dynamite from the Germans eventually took preference over handcrafting explosives. The British Special Operations Executive also parachuted tons of explosives to its agents in France for essential sabotage missions. 310. The railways were a favorite target of saboteurs, who soon understood that removing bolts from the tracks was far more efficient than planting explosives. Train derailment strategies varied considerably in their effectiveness. The Germans managed to repair the tracks quickly in agricultural areas with level ground, since the salvage of some material was a relatively easy proposition in such terrain. But unbolting a connector plate on an outside rail in a mountainous area, given the higher speed of trains going downhill, could result in the derailment of an entire train with considerable amounts of front-ready material strewn far down the mountainside. Among the SNCF employees who joined the resistance, a subset were in resistance fur, which focused on reporting the movement of German troops to the Allied forces and sabotaging the railway's rolling stock as well as their infrastructure. Following the invasions of Normandy and Provence in 1944, the sabotage of rail transport became much more frequent and effectively prevented some German troop deployments to the front and hindered the subsequent retreat of German occupying forces. 311. Generally, the sabotage of equipment leaving armaments factories and derailment in areas where equipment could not readily be salvaged was a more discreet form of resistance, and probably at least as effective as bombing. Sabotage by resistance freed up vulnerable and expensive aircraft for other uses rather than risk heavy losses by attacking heavily defended targets. It was also preferred since it caused less collateral damage and fewer civilian casualties than Allied bombing. 82. Guerrilla warfare. Simon Seguin in 1944. After the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, communists engaged in guerrilla warfare, attacking German forces in French cities. In July 1942, the Allies' failure to open a second front resulted in a wave of communist guerrilla attacks aimed at maximizing the number of Germans deployed in the West to give the USSR military relief. 312. The assassinations that took place during summer and autumn 1941, starting with Colonel Pierre Georges Fabien's shooting of a German officer in the Paris metro, caused fierce reprisals and executions of hundreds of French hostages. As a result, the clandestine press was very discreet about the events, and the communists soon decided to discontinue the assassinations. From July to October 1943, groups in Paris engaging in attacks against occupying soldiers were better organized. Joseph Epstein was assigned responsibility for training resistance fighters across the city, and his new commandos of 15 men perpetrated a number of attacks that could not have been carried out before. The commandos were drawn from the foreign branch of the Frankstierers et partisans, and the most famous of them was the Manouchian group. An FFI fighter, role in the liberation of France and casualties. A group of resistance at the time of their joining forces with the Canadian Army at Boulogne in September 1944. Main article, Liberation of France. Defining the precise role of the French resistance during the German occupation, or assessing its military importance alongside the Allied forces during the liberation of France, is difficult. The two forms of resistance, active and passive, 313, and the North-South occupational divide, 314, allow for many interpretations, but what can broadly be agreed on is a synopsis of the events which took place. Following the surrender of fascist Italy in September 1943, a significant example of resistance strength was displayed when the Corsican resistance joined forces with the Free French to liberate the island from General Albert Kesselring's remaining German forces, 315. On mainland France itself, in the wake of the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944, the FFI and the Communist Fighting Groups FTP, theoretically unified under the command of General Pierre Koenig, 137, fought alongside the Allies to free the rest of France. Several color-coded plans were coordinated for sabotage, most importantly Plan Vert Green for railways, Plan Blue Blue for power installations, and Plan Violet Purple for telecommunications, 316, 317, 318. To complement these missions, smaller plans were drafted. Plan Rouge Red for German ammunition depots, Plan Jaune Yellow for German command posts, Plan Noir Black for German fuel depots, and Plan Tortue Tortoise for road traffic. 318-162. Their paralysis of German infrastructure is widely thought to have been very effective. 319. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote in his memoirs praising the role the resistance played in the liberation of Brittany. The French resistance movement, which here numbered 30,000 men, played a notable part, and the peninsula was quickly overrun. 320. Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division parading after the battle for Paris, August 1944. French resistance fighters in Paris at the Hôtel de Ville, 1944. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, with the support of Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division, was one of the most famous and glorious moments of the French resistance. Although it is again difficult to gauge their effectiveness precisely, popular anti-German demonstrations, such as general strikes by the Paris Metro, the gendarmerie and the police, took place and fighting ensued. The liberation of most of southwestern, central and southeastern France was finally fulfilled with the arrival of the 1st French Army of General de Lattre de Tassigny, which landed in Provence in August 1944 and was backed by over 25,000 Maquis, 321. One source often referred to as General Dwight D. Eisenhower's comment in his military memoir, Crusade in Europe. Throughout France, the Free French had been of inestimable value in the campaign. They were particularly active in Brittany, but on every portion of the front, we secured help from them in a multitude of ways. Without their great assistance, the liberation of France and the defeat of the enemy in Western Europe would have consumed a much longer time and meant greater losses to ourselves. 322. General Eisenhower also estimated the value of the resistance to have been equal to 10 to 15 divisions at the time of the landings. One infantry division comprised about 10,000 soldiers. 323-324. Eisenhower's statements are all the more credible since he based them on his GHQ's formal analyses and published them only after the war, when propaganda was no longer a motive. Historians still debate how effective the French resistance was militarily, 325, but the neutralization of the Maquis du Verkers alone involved the commitment of over 10,000 German troops within the theater. with several more thousand held in reserve. As the Allied invasion was advancing from Normandy and French Operation Jedburgh commandos were being dropped nearby to the south to prepare for the Allied landing in Provence. One American officer, Ralph Ingersoll, who served in chief, wrote in his book Top Secret, "What cut the ice with us was the fact that, when we came to France, the resistance was so effective that it took half a dozen real live German divisions to contend with it, divisions which might otherwise have been on our backs in the bocage. And it made the most cynical sit up and take notice when we learned from German field officers that the Germans in central France were truly terrified, had to live under arms, could not move freely, had lost all control in sizable sectors even before we came. It was a military fact that the French were worth at least a score of divisions to us, maybe more, 326. It is estimated that FFI killed some 2,000 Germans, a low estimate based on the figures from June 1944 only, 325. Estimates of the casualties among the resistance are made harder by the dispersion of movements at least until D-Day, but credible estimates start from 8,000 dead in action, 25,000 shot and several tens of thousands deported, 327, for perspective. The best estimate is that 86,000 were deported from France without racial motive, overwhelmingly comprising resistance fighters, and more than the number of gypsies and Jews deported from France, 328. Legacy. Veterans of the resistance raise flags at the annual commemoration ceremony of Canjuer's military camp. Epurations, purges. Women accused of collaboration with their heads shaved. Immediately following the liberation, France was swept by a wave of executions, public humiliations, assaults and detentions of suspected collaborators, known as the Epuration Sauvage Wild Purge. 329. This period succeeded the German occupational administration, but preceded the authority of the French provisional government, and consequently lacked any form of institutional justice. 329. Approximately 9,000 were executed, mostly without trial as summary executions, 329, notably including members and leaders of the pro-Nazi militias. In one case, as many as 77 militias members were summarily executed at once. 330, an inquest into the issue of summary executions launched by Jules Mock, the Minister of the Interior, came to the conclusion that there were 9,673 summary executions. A second inquest in 1952 separated out 8,867 executions of suspected collaborators and 1,950